Hello. Hi. Yes, forcing you to sit back down. No more coffee, no more drinks. Hey, Gabe. Thank you for having me, for letting me sit in on this panel. You give me really the light duty to talk about long-term obligations and funding challenges. I want to introduce, I'm just going to introduce briefly the three gentlemen here and let them give you a few overview points on kind of their view on the long view, I guess we should say, and then I'll have a couple of questions, and then we certainly hope you've got some questions as well. I find the topic of public employee retirement, well, what I got dragged into, I think, as a reporter. I mean, the longer you stay in Sacramento, the more you have to be the guy to write the stories about public employee pensions. So I'm wearing that title with excitement. But I also find it's one of the most interesting topics for me because it hits three things that I think are so challenging for any discussion about governance: policy, law, and politics. The policy of how you deal with these funding issues and the choices that are made, the politics of dealing with them, and the law, which is we're finding in California is going to be a fascinating topic to look at in the months ahead as we have someone decide exactly what those laws say and what can or can't be done about them. So each of these gentlemen obviously have unique perspectives, from the overview of what's going on in California to what's going on in communities to ways to look at solutions that might be out there. I think most of their information is probably in the information you've already gotten. So we're going to start with Mac Taylor. I like how it says Mac is the legislative analyst for the California Legislative Analyst Office. He is, in fact, the legislative analyst. I like to give you "the" at the topic of that as the man with the information. And Mac, I think, is going to give us a little bit of the overview from the state, and then we'll kind of drill down into communities from there.
All right. Well, thank you, the John Myers.
I don't get a "the." I'm not appointed.
Yeah, I do feel a little bit like the setup person for Dane and Chuck, which I'll get into is why I don't think it's as big a problem for the state as it is for locals. But let me just go over some basics to make sure we're all sort of on the same page here as we discuss this issue. These legacy costs are basically retirement-related expenses associated with public employees that were not paid for when the services were provided. It's pretty simple. We didn't pay for it when we should have. And this is a failure. This is not desired. You should never have unfunded liabilities. And the problems are, it means that you didn't recognize your employee compensation costs at the time that you were getting those services. And then what that means, of course, is you, in effect, have sort of borrowed money. It's a form of debt. You've pushed those expenses off into the future so that people now are paying not only for the retirement-related expenses of current services being provided by public employees, but they're paying for a piece of the services that were provided in the past. So these unfunded liabilities have been growing and are very large. So just to give you a couple of numbers, don't want to overwhelm anybody here, but at the state level, we estimate that these unfunded liabilities are about $225 billion. And for some perspective, that's about 120% of our entire state budget one year. So these are big numbers. The locals, they're probably as big, if not even bigger. And these relate to our teacher system, CalSTRS, to our main public sector union, CalPERS, University of California, judges systems, all state-related unfunded liabilities. So how did we get here? How did we incur these unfunded liabilities? Well, it's for a variety of reasons. Mainly, we've increased benefits. Back in 1999 was the big point at which we increased benefits substantially. We gave them retroactively, which just creates immediately a lot of unfunded liability. So it's not just that you increase benefits prospectively for people where you can start funding them, but you gave them for past service, which you should never do. We've had some generous earnings assumptions by the funds. We assumed that they'll be earning in the past at 7.5, 7.75. And what that means is that's the sort of discount rate that you use to take those future liabilities and bring them into present value terms. And so if you have a high discount rate, those future liabilities are worth less. If you have a low discount rate or an earnings rate, it means you don't have as big an unfunded liability. So the systems have been bringing their earnings assumption rates down, and that means that the liabilities grow. And that's been a source of our problems too. And finally, we've had just differences in actuarial assumptions. People are either living longer, taking benefits longer, and that increases your liabilities. I think it's really important to understand, though, that at the state and for locals, these are defined benefit programs. These are guaranteed lifetime annuities. And so it's not just you have a pot of money and it goes as far as it can, like your IRA or your savings account. No matter what, if you live till 110, you're going to get that monthly payment. And with defined benefit plans, a key aspect of it is that the government sector, the employer, is on the hook for any increases in normal costs, ongoing cost of the system, any increase in unfunded liabilities. The employer is responsible for those. And that's in part due to what we call the California rule, which I'm sure that our folks here might want to talk some more about, which basically says it's very difficult to make changes to an employee's retirement plan as soon as they've been hired, for as long as they maintain sort of employment in the public sector. Now, the state has these defined benefit plans, and you could argue, well, that's a problem because the public sector generally does not offer these anymore. They're very rare now. And we also have very generous defined benefit plans. I want to make it very clear, I don't think that having generous retirement plans is in of itself a problem. In fact, you can make almost the opposite case, that we want people to save more. And that's what retirement and saving for pensions and or health care when you retire, that's what you're doing. You're deferring current income and saving it for the future. We want people to do that. The problem is we're not recognizing the full cost of what we're granting to people, and we're not paying for it at the time that those services are being delivered. This is defined benefit plans are in contrast to defined contribution plans. People know as 401ks, IRAs, in which the individual controls the monies. The individual is at risk for investment returns, either up or down, as opposed to, again, under the defined benefit plans, where the government, the public sector, is at risk for changes in assets or changes in the plans. So what's the impact on the state of these growing unfunded liabilities? Well, our total state retirement-related costs are only about 6%. So that doesn't seem like a lot. The problem is they've been growing so rapidly. Over the last 25 years, they've been growing at about an 8% annual rate. And my office has projected that they're going to grow at maybe even slightly faster, 9% in the coming years. Now, if your revenues are only growing 5% or so, even at that small percentage of your overall budget, that's eating up a lot of your annual revenue growth. So it's something that even at the state level, you have to be concerned about. Now, why is it not as big a problem for the state as it is for locals? Very simple math. At the state level, our budget, only about a quarter or less of our spending is on state employees. We give out a lot of money to local school districts, as we call it local assistance. It's not associated with people actually doing work up in Sacramento. Only about a quarter of our budget are personnel-related costs. So you have a much smaller part of your budget on which these retirement-related costs are increasing. For the locals, and this is what these guys will be talking about, their personnel-related portions of their non-enterprise budgets are 80%?
Yeah, just flip it. I mean, 75%.
75 to 80. And again, Dane and Chuck can speak to this much better than I can. But that's why it's a much bigger problem for the locals than it is for the state. Not to saying it's not a problem at the state level, just relatively speaking. Now, so what are the future risks? We've got these big numbers. Well, they could get worse. If we have a downturn in the economy, particularly if we have a downturn in financial markets, a real correction or a downturn, you have the cost that will go up even faster at a time in which your revenue streams are much lower. So there are big risks out there. In addition, the state is now feeling lots of pressures from local governments and school districts to assist them, to provide them with some type of relief. So that's just a different angle at the state level. So it's a little bit ironic in some ways that we're talking about these large legacy costs, because in recent years, the state has actually taken some pretty significant actions to address them. And let me just run them off real quickly. We've passed what's called PEPRA, which basically went in and reduced the benefits that are provided by CalPERS, CalSTRS, basically retirement systems in the state. It reduced benefits somewhat. It shifted some of the cost, more of the cost to locals on an ongoing basis. The problem with PEPRA is that, again, because of the California rule that I mentioned earlier, these changes only apply to newly elected personnel. Doesn't apply to the vast bulk of people who are already employed. So the savings are in the future, far in the future. So these were important changes. It's just that we won't realize the benefits of them in the very near future. It'll be the next generation who will benefit from the changes made by PEPRA. We did a CalSTRS funding plan, which was, to me, an amazing accomplishment. It had a huge unfunded liability, and what we did is we said to districts, you're going to have increased rates that you're going to have to pay. The state is going to chip in added money, and we're going to try to address the unfunded liability over roughly a 30-year period. The state started pre-funding its retiree health benefits. And again, we're chipping in more money, we'll be chipping in more and more, and it's going to take a long time, but we are making some progress on that substantial unfunded liability also. So just in closing, I know these gentlemen will talk more about it, and we can answer a question on this, but sort of what additional actions might be needed in the future? Well, one thing that our current governor has raised is he would like to see the California rule apparently overturned, modified, I'm not sure exactly what. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You might need a constitutional amendment to do it, but I've personally never understood why you can't change the benefits that accrue prospectively to current employees. We change other aspects of your compensation, salary, other types of benefits. Why shouldn't you be able to change? Now, the flip side of that is I think you should make sure you guarantee the benefits that have been accrued to date. This is not in any way trying to go in and change what people have already earned. But looking prospectively, I think that's a very reasonable thing for the state to look at. You can think about changing from defined benefits to defined contribution plans. When the governor, pre-PEPRA, when he first introduced his plan, he had a hybrid where you would have roughly half would be defined contribution, the other half would be defined benefit. Certainly that's a reasonable thing to look at. The important thing to remember about defined contribution plans, there is no unfunded liability associated with them. That is the great strength of them from an employer's perspective. You give what you give, you can contribute, you can be as generous or not with the employee, but that's it. Now, the downside to employees, obviously, is they bear the investment risk. They have a pot of money, they can determine how it's invested. If it does well, they do well. If it does poorly, they do poorly. There's no guaranteed lifetime benefit when they retire. You could go in and prohibit retroactive benefits. You could do many other things. But with that, John, why don't I stop and turn it over to my colleagues?
Dane Hutchings, who works with the League of California Cities. You can hit that little mic right there.
I have a power.
Oh, you want to do it?
I was gonna. Don't know if do you want me to stand up here? Okay. Yeah. Let me just.
Right.
Pop over here.
And I think part of what Dane is going to present to you, I'm guessing, is partly what some of us saw. Was it last week?
Yeah,
I've lost 2 weeks. I've lost track of time. Of a survey they did of cities and the challenges those cities are facing with the long-term funding. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Yeah, my name is Dane Hutchings with the League of California Cities. Quickly, we're an organization that represents about 470, I think 77 of the 482 California cities. I do all things pensions, workers' comp, all things employee relations, and so I've been doing that for the last couple of years here at the League of Cities. Since my first day, really, pensions has really been the talking, like the top priority for my membership. Our board has recently adopted a series of pension principles and instructed us to commission a study. And so what I wanted to do was share some of the key findings. The entire report can be found on our website, and I'm happy to answer questions about that too, but I know we're a bit short on time, so I'll sort of fly through these slides. I also want to say a couple things too. So, the League of Cities, we're a pro-defined benefit organization. Our board has adopted that position. We're firmly a pro-defined benefit organization. We also, as Mac mentioned, we do recognize that PEPRA was a great step. It was a step in the right direction. The challenge is, so it's not going to impact our city budgets for about 25 to 30 more years, essentially, when those PEPRA employees start to retire. And so the challenge is how do we get from year 1 today into year 30 until PEPRA really starts impacting our budgets. And Last but not least, I joke around with the actuaries over at CalPERS and say, you haven't built an assumption yet for what happens if a city can't pay their minimum payments. And we have now we've now seen what happens when agencies default. And if essentially what happens is that each agency has a pool that's funded to, cash on hand versus cash owed. And so we've seen up in the city of Loyalton, their retirees saw a 65% reduction in their benefits. We've seen some other sanitation districts where they've seen reductions in their benefits for as much as 90%. And of course, the most notable one being a Joint Powers Authority down in Southern California that saw a 65% reduction for about 200 retirees. So imagine being retired for 10 years and all of a sudden getting a letter in the mail from CalPERS saying your pension's been cut by 65%. So those are the real fears, and that's really why my membership's so engaged, because I think we all want the same thing, a stable, defined benefit system. It's just how we get there is really the challenge. And so one of the things that we did that we've been working on for the past 18 months or so is we commissioned an actuary, John Bartel and Associates. He's a very reputable actuary in the state, and we did two things. One, we pulled all of the data that we could from CalPERS directly. So there's 447 cities in the CalPERS system. And so we took that and we were able to, in using CalPERS' assumptions, including their discount rate and their assumed projected growth of payroll, projected out what employee costs are going to be as a percentage of payroll directly to CalPERS. And it's important to note that this does not include any sort of active or retiree health care, and this doesn't include any other benefits. This is strictly the employer portion going to PERS. The second thing we did is we surveyed our members. And so we had about 195 responses covering most of the major population centers of the state of California. And what we did was we said, okay, give us a snapshot of your general fund budget, so that they use their CAFRs and be able to fill out this information. And what we did was we combined that information together to say, okay, we know how much your contribution is going to be, and we know how much your total general fund is going to be. We're going to be able to, we use John Bartel to kind of crunch the numbers and say, what is your total percentage of general fund that's going to be going to PERS, again, not including healthcare or any other benefits. And so I'll go ahead and jump right into it. And so, again, this is just some of the methodology that we use. And again, I've shared my slides, and so you guys are more than welcome to take them. But these are the data points that we used. And so the preliminary findings, the study evaluated the percentage of city general fund budgets. And so we see that percentages range anywhere from 15% to over 23% of total general fund revenues going to pension costs alone for our cities. And so, and specifically, there's about 10% of cities that are going to be going over 20% of total general fund budget. So 10% of cities is still about 47 cities. It's not a great number. And so you can look at this. We did a series of heat maps, and so what you'll see, the gray areas here are either cities that we didn't get valid responses from, or there were no cities in those counties. And so we broke it down by county. And so this is general fund budgets as of about 2006, 2007. You can see most of the folks are around 7.5% of general fund budget. You go over to today, and you see those same cities, and those numbers on the right are moving up a little bit. You've got some areas that are more in the 15% or more of general fund budget, going up and down the state. And then by fiscal year 24-25, it's projected that most of the state is going to be a little bit on the higher end, about 15% of general fund budget. Again, 10% of cities going over 21% of total general fund budgets. By comparison, I think Max said 6%. I talked to Michael Cohen over at the Department of Finance. They said if you include retiree health, all obligations, I think that he said it was about 8%. But suffice it to say, 8% compared to 22%, just a little bit of an apples to apples comparison a little bit. When we're going further, we're looking at on the percentage of payroll side. For miscellaneous employees, it looks like that city respondents will pay anywhere about 29% of their payroll, with some employers paying over 50% of payroll for just the miscellaneous pool of employees, not including public safety. And so that means for every $100 in payroll, you're paying anywhere from $29 to $49 more by fiscal years 24 or 25 as a percentage of payroll. And so the reason why this map is a little bit more colored in is because, again, we used all of CalPERS' data directly, and so we just pulled strictly the CalPERS data and their assumptions. And so you can see from miscellaneous rates by county by fiscal years 24, 25, it looks like we've got some cities that are in the 37.5% or more, and then it factors down. So, but even the green is about 22% of general fund, or I'm sorry, of payroll going directly to CalPERS. And as Max said, payroll is about 75% of our entire general fund, so it's pretty significant. When we look on the safety side, I mean, there's really no way to hide it. Safety guys cost more. You know, they've got the 3850 formulas. They're a little bit more generous than the miscellaneous. And so on this, you're seeing anywhere from $51 to $91 more going to CalPERS for every $100 of payroll. And so when you look at the next slide, the map looks kind of the same, but look at the numbers on the right-hand side. And so the numbers, I mean, so red on this for the public safety side is more than 65% of total general fund payroll. You're looking at, you know, the pink being 65%, you know, 60%, and even the green is 40% of total payroll going to PERS, and again, not including any other benefits associated with that. And then the last slide I want to show, just because, again, I pulled this directly from CalPERS, but it is something that keeps my city managers up at night. It keeps all of us figuring out how do we try to find a way to attack this problem? Because the challenge that we find ourselves in is that, you know, the higher contributions go to CalPERS, that's less money that we can pay employees. Therefore, we have to eliminate services or reduce services. Well, that means that those employees that are left have to pay more money, and the employer has to pick up more money, and then we have to end up reducing services again. And so we're in this vicious cycle. So according to CalPERS, in 2001, there were about 2 active workers for every retiree. That's, I mean, we'd like to see it like more like 4 to 1, but even 2 to 1 is good. It means you got 2 folks paying into the system for every one person who's retired. You know, but by in the next 10 to 20 years, CalPERS projects we're going to have about a half a worker for every retiree. That's the wrong side of the paradigm that we want to be on. We want more folks in the system. So again, you know, the league is a pro-defined benefit organization. We're trying to work with our organized labor counterparts. We want to work with CalPERS and really all stakeholders to do a couple things. 1, to try to drive more awareness on this issue. Number 2, to try to find ways that we can work collaboratively, because what we certainly don't want is to see those benefits reduced for our retirees, or even some of our cities have to make some of these very tough choices where, you know, because they can't eliminate, you know, under the California rule, conceivably you couldn't eliminate cost of living adjustments for retirees. So then we have to eliminate retiree health care. If you were to ask most retirees, I bet you they'd take a haircut on their cost of living adjustment if it meant being able to save their health care. So our hands are tied a bit, and so we're looking forward to working collaboratively with folks to see if we can't find some other solutions so we can try and get to that year 30 when Pepper starts kicking in. And so with that, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Speaking of the now what category, I think that's you, Chuck. Chuck Reed, who was the mayor of San Jose and has been active in a lot of the discussions about the potential options for what might lie ahead. He's perfectly teed you up there, I think.
Thanks. Well, welcome everybody. A couple of disclaimers and disclosures in the beginning. In case your eyes are as weak as mine, I am not a young American, despite the forum here. But I do have a couple of young Americans in my family, and I'd like to look out for them. I am a CalPERS pensioner, and I want to make sure I get paid every penny that I've earned. And I want to say,
but not more.
Not more. You paid what I've earned, and every CalPERS pensioner should get paid what they've earned. I'm actually an advocate for retirement security, and that includes defined benefit systems, but I recognize that defined benefit systems are risky, inherently unstable, and cause a lot of trouble if they're not properly funded, which is a chronic condition in California as around the country. I'm a director of the Retirement Security Initiative. We're a bipartisan advocacy group for fair and sustainable pensions. We're working in more than a dozen states around the country, including Colorado. We have some principles in which we work in all the various states. We support measures that are consistent with these principles. Probably the number one is that these plans and benefits need to be paid for. It doesn't matter what kind of a plan or what kind of a system you have. If you don't put the money in, it won't work. And that's been a problem in California, a failure to put the money in, as has been described earlier. The League of Cities report's a great report. I commend it. It's aggregated a lot of information. I'm going to give you a little bit more specific information based on my years with the city of San Jose as a former mayor. So in 2012, San Jose shocked the country with a ballot measure that was approved by the voters by nearly a 70% yes vote in a Democratic city, in a Democratic county, in a Democratic state, yet we got a 70% yes vote. What led up to that was 10 years of cutting services to balance the budget. And we are kind of like 10 years ahead of the CalPERS cities. If you look at the numbers and the projections that you just saw in the CalPERS in the League of Cities presentation, we just got there earlier with huge funding shortfalls that we filled by cutting services. We cut 2,000 jobs out of our workforce. We went from 7,400 to 5,400 jobs. And we didn't just eliminate vacant positions, we laid people off. Now, you know, when you're laying off firefighters and cops, you pretty much reach the end of the line, what you can do in a way of cutting services to balance the budget. And so we adopted a fiscal reform plan that included this pension reform measure that was approved in 2012. San Jose runs two independent plans. They're not part of CalPERS, which is how we got there earlier, because we're not in CalPERS. Our plans have earned more than 7.5% since their inception. We've never taken a pension holiday. We always put in the money that we thought we should based on the actuarial projections. We're a AA plus rated city in terms of, or AA1 rated city in terms of general obligation bonds. We're usually #1 in the country in job creation, and yet we had billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. When you look at what that means to a budget, you realize that we're putting a lot more money into retirement costs. This is a graphic of San Jose that shows the increase in what we put into our plans, and that included payment for OPEB, as it's called, other post-employment benefits, more commonly known as retiree health care. So retiree health care and pensions, enormous increases. Now, the CalPERS cities are beginning to experience those enormous increases, which is why they're catching up with us. But because we were having to pay these enormous increases, we were cutting services to balance the budget because the revenues weren't going up fast enough to do that, although we did get more revenues as well. We went to the voters for revenues 5 times while I was mayor on revenue measures, and they've been back since then with another tax increase. I show this slide all over the country in various states and various locations, and I could probably identify 1,000 jurisdictions in the country that you could use this graphic. Just take off the San Jose and slap on another city. It happens all over California. The slope of that line, those increases, is not unusual. It's very common. Now, back to the bigger picture. CalPERS, I call this 18 years of systemic failure. Since 1999 to the date, it's been red ink. That pension debt, the mountain of debt, keeps getting bigger. And I say it's a systemic failure. I don't just point at CalPERS. We have a system in California. The legislature plays a role, the taxpayers play a role. Whoever's responsible, what I know is the debt keeps growing. Those are just the facts. These are numbers right out of the CalPERS financial information. CalSTRS, smaller plan, same problem, same direction, same systemic failure. And the failure is we're just not putting enough money in for a lot of reasons. We don't have to necessarily get into all the reasons. What I'm saying is we have a systemic problem, and you'll see those increases in the CalPERS numbers throughout the cities all over the state. And that's just the facts. Now, I might add that these are the optimistic numbers, because these are based on assumed rates of return, discount rates, that are probably overly optimistic, because it's certainly on the optimistic side. A lot of people try to figure out, well, what if it's not so optimistic? What if we don't get a 7% return? What if we live in a 6% world? This is a graphic put together by Alicia Manel of the Boston Center for Retirement Research. And that is, you don't need to see the cities, this is not cities, the states. What you need to look at is the dark lines are what we're paying now, The gray lines are what we will need to pay if we live in a 6% world. And you can see California is not the worst, but we're going to have a huge increase if we live in a 6% world instead of a 7% or 7.5% world. Many of these states are that. Some states are still thinking they're in an 8% world. But there's some enormous increases. So this is a less optimistic, maybe it's a pessimistic scenario, but even CalPERS own experts are saying, you know, we're probably looking at a 6 to 6.1, 6.2% rate of return over the next 10 years. So a 6% world could certainly happen. Oh, I forgot to add the $91 billion of obligations we owe for retiree health care that was mentioned earlier. The controller just put out a report with the updated numbers. So that's the optimistic scenario. Let me back up and just talk about some of the reform efforts. Despite how difficult things are in California, there are other states that are in worse condition, worse shape, but there are also states that have taken on pension reform. So it's not a hopeless case. California is not hopeless, other states are not. Just in the last couple of years, we've had significant and substantive pension reform efforts in Michigan, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Arizona, Florida, and Kentucky. And some of those are in multi-phase pension reforms, like Kentucky. Kentucky did the funding first, and now they're working on the benefits. But nevertheless, there are places in which there are difficult decisions being made to try to make the plans and funds sustainable. Paying down the unfunded liabilities, putting more money in, and in some cases changing the benefits. Most of the work is being done with regard to new employees. Why? Because it's a lot easier. Those new employees don't know who they are, they're not organized, they're not represented by anybody, and so you can make changes for them a lot easier than you can for current employees who are organized, they know who they are, and you have to affect their expectations about their jobs, so it's more difficult. But in some states, they are taking on current employees as well. Now, California. California today is the 21st day of February. Probably nobody in the room knows that today is the day that the amicus briefs, friends of the court briefs, and applications to file in the Supreme Court are due in the case of CAL FIRE versus CalPERS. One of three cases the California Supreme Court is considering that deals with the California rule that was mentioned earlier. The California rule, generally described by the public employee unions, is that on day one an employee is hired, whatever level of benefits they expect to accrue can never be changed except to go up. You can never make adjustments in those expectations of the accrual rates of all of their retirement benefits. Only goes up, never goes down, which means it's awfully tough to save money on your current employees and impossible to save money on your retirees. But that rule is being challenged in three cases. The governor has filed a brief. The parties have filed their briefs, and today is the day the friends of the court briefs are filed. And I've been involved in organizing parties, funders, and lawyers to do amicus briefs. The California Business Roundtable has filed one earlier on Friday, and more will be filed today. So for you news hawks, the briefs will be filed today, and I'm sure posted by the Supreme Court in the next day or so. That could change everything, because in California we have to work within the law. And as mayor, when I would go talk to my unions about this pension issue, we could talk about new employees, but we couldn't talk about current employees. Why? Because it's unconstitutional. No union leader is going to sit down at the table and talk to you about doing something that's unconstitutional. They'll get fired. So you never have a conversation. You never get to negotiations at how best to deal with the pension problems, because it's off the table. And if it's off the table, you don't ever make any progress. The California Supreme Court could change that. They could change the legal framework. It changes the beginning of the discussion of the negotiations. And what we've asked them to do with our amicus briefs is make the future negotiable. People have earned what they've earned, they've accrued what they've accrued, but what they expect in next year's work, or next year's benefits for next year's work, could be modified. Just like we can modify their pay, we can even lay them off. They're not guaranteed a job. They're not guaranteed a specific rate of pay. When their contract runs out, you got to do negotiations. The same thing should be done with pension benefits, but it hasn't been. So what happens now? There's really 3 or 4 things that get done. First is do nothing. That's the most popular. Do nothing, just kick the can down the road. Unfortunately, the can keeps getting bigger. You can put more money into the plans. In almost all cases around the country, in almost all of the pension reform situations, they need to put more money in. California needs to put more money in. You can't pay off this pension debt unless you put more money in. The question is, how do you go about doing that? One of the ways it's being done around the country is the benefits for new employees are different. The savings are automatically going in to help pay down the unfunded liability, or they're making special payments on the unfunded liability while changing the benefits on a going forward basis. You can raise taxes. That's very common as well. We did it in San Jose. It's been done in California. Now, you hardly ever tell people you're just going to take the money and put it into their pension debt. That doesn't sell very well, so you tell people if you don't raise taxes, we're going to have to cut some other services so we can pay our pension debt. But nevertheless, if you look at the tax increases across the country, and there's been some academic work done on this, most of the new revenues in most of the jurisdictions at state and local government is going to pay for increasing pension costs. That only a small proportion of the additional revenues actually are going in to provide additional new services. Now, let's keep this really simple. You don't need an actuary. I'm just going to tell you how to figure it out in your city. What's going on in your city? Let's take Sacramento, for example, since we're in Sacramento. If you Google CAFR, C-A-F-R, Sacramento 2017, you'll find the 2017 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. You can do this for any city in the country, and they're almost all the same. Skip the mumbo jumbo at the first 200 pages. Go to the statistical section at the back. You will find data, 10 years of data on all kinds of things. Look and see what's happened to the employment. Full-time equivalent jobs is usually how they describe it. What's happened to those jobs over the last 10 years in your city? And then you can look at revenues. What's happened to revenues in your city over the last 10 years? And Sacramento is very common. Revenues are up by about 15%. Staffing is down by about 15%. That is a very, very common characteristic of your cities because we're crowding out services in order to pay for the cost of pensions and health care. That's just a fact. It happened in San Jose. We crowded out services to pay for these costs. And if you can't do anything about the costs going forward, except put more money in, you either raise taxes or cut services, or do nothing. Borrow money, do some gimmicks. Raise taxes, cut services, or reform the benefits. It's a very narrow range of things that you can do. But if you want to figure it out for your city, it's pretty easy to do. And then you need to go ask the question, what are we going to do about it? And in California, we hope that the answer will soon be, you can negotiate changes to save yourselves from disaster. Because even though CalPERS is a really big system, it's the largest in the country, it is really 2,000 individual pots of money. If the city of San Jose fails and we don't put money into our pension plans, we're not going to be able to pay the benefits. If the city of Sacramento fails and doesn't put money into the pension plans, CalPERS is not going to bail them out. It will be the employees and the retirees of Sacramento that have to bear the brunt of that. So it's the cities that fail, that go into distress, either insolvency or bankruptcy, however you want to call it. Everybody is at risk, the employees, the taxpayers, and the retirees. We want to avoid that. We want these plans to be fully funded so that retirees don't have to worry about whether or not their city is going to survive for the next 50 years. And with that, I'm going to stop.
So we're all very optimistic. I have just a couple of questions I was going to ask the panel, and Dane, you might want to hit that one on there so you and Chuck are both talking. Max down there too. I just had a couple of questions for the panel, and then we'll get some of your thoughts as well before we run out of time. It strikes me in listening to all of you and in knowing a little about the topic, it strikes me that one of the things that we all talk about, but I hear various ways to deal with, is volatility. There's volatility because it's simply the way that we get the money that we need for these benefits, that we've invested the money, we're watching the markets, we have predictions of what the markets will do and what the rate of return will be. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're too low, sometimes they're too high. And I think, Mac, you even said this at a point about volatility, because, I mean, in its most basic form, the volatility either is the responsibility of the employer under a defined benefit model or the responsibility of the employee under a defined contribution 401k. Is there some way of dealing with, I mean, could we talk just for a moment about, is there any way to put policy or any other limiters or walls around volatility? Do we ultimately have to address either volatility now or what we do if if the numbers change in the future? Because we can have the best ideas in the world and the market can totally sink them, it seems like to me. And it always comes back to, like, what do we do with that volatility? And I'm trying not to get too much into the predictions of rates of return and optimistic, conservative, liberal, but just simply the notion of volatility. And wouldn't a good policy solution try to figure out how you, if you can, limit the volatility or put some kind of different way of thinking about it?
Well, I'm not sure it's that much different from the discussion we have about volatility in the state budget. And that is, you have benefits of having a volatile personal income tax structure, which presumably the prior panel talked about. You have a more robust income stream on average, but you have to deal with the volatility. Similarly, if you have pension plans that are 50% in the equities market, they're going to have volatility. You need to deal with that. But I'm not sure it's that much different from, that should probably mean that you should have reserves. That is, during good times, like what we're in now, you probably should be overfunded. Maybe you should be at 125%. So I'm not sure it's that much different from the way we think about our state budget of, during good times, you better have that surplus built up to deal with those possible downturns.
Mm-hmm. Of course, in some good times, when we had a good time in the past, we pushed up the benefits too, at least from a statewide level.
Just like you could argue,
and a lot of locals followed suit.
That in good times before we had reserves, we would spend it, commit to an ongoing stream that we couldn't support.
Right.
Well, volatility is inherently a problem because of the risk that it provides. Somehow you have to figure out how to manage and spread the risk. So in the current system, almost all of the risk is borne solely by the taxpayers. And what we need to do with our system, and I'll just speak to California, but it's just true around the country, is if you look at the decision makers in the system, and I don't just mean the CalPERS board, I mean the system, including the legislature, and the people who are making decisions, almost all of them, all of us, have an incentive to underfund the plan, to keep the normal costs, the annual costs, as low as possible. And that runs up the debt. And so the volatility just works in one direction. It's a ratchet. It just adds to the debt. But you could fix that. You could design a defined benefit plan, and there are systems in the country that don't have debt. You could design a defined benefit plan to minimize that and change how that risk is handled. You can spread the risk and have a hybrid plan where part of the benefit is defined benefit and part of it is defined contribution. There's something in the middle called a cash balance plan. So the design of the plan isn't that hard. It's the politics of getting a plan design and the politics of whether or not you're going to fund it properly. Because everybody wants to promise a benefit, over-promising and underfunding. Mm-hmm. And that's an inherent flaw in the system. And we all suffer from that because as an elected official, it's a wonderful thing to be able to give people stuff. It's even more wonderful if you don't have to pay for it.
But may I interject here because this gets to another topic before I run out of my time. If I may say, as the only person I think who has served in elected office here on the panel, you are, right? You haven't served in elected office either. Okay, so I'm
Student council count?
Okay,
No.
so Fact check, I am right. Chuck Reed's the only one who's been in elected office. But at some point, the responsibility does come back on some of these local levels to local officials who have made agreements for these benefits that were overly generous, at least in the long run. I mean, they sat down at bargaining tables. They made these. They approved these contracts.
Well, you can spread the blame. There's plenty of blame to go around. But
I'm starting at the local level.
The people who should bear most of the blame are the local elected officials, because we made the decisions. We're supposed to be looking out for the taxpayers. We made some bad decisions. The question in California is, okay, if we made a bad decision, how can we go about fixing that? In California, you can't fix it because of the California rule, which is why the Supreme Court case is so important. But if you think about the CalPERS system, if some local government wants to go about trying to fix things, it's very difficult because they're constrained by the CalPERS rules. The legislature sets those. They have to work within the CalPERS framework. And if they decide they want to stop putting people into their failing defined benefit plan and put them in a defined contribution plan, there's an exit fee that CalPERS charges that's probably 5 times their unfunded liability. So nobody does that. So the constraints placed on local government are severe and very difficult, and my pity is for anybody who's in a CalPERS plan.
That's the perfect transition to here, because that's where the rubber meets the road of, because I was going to say, Dane, if I can really quickly, part of the reason I asked about the volatility is if you limit the volatility by basically relying on other solutions to come up with the money, the transition phase for local communities is quite extreme, as your numbers have shown.
Correct. And just I want to dovetail quickly on what Chuck had mentioned, and to your question about the onus being on local governments. The way I explain it to my members is that I call this an institutional failure, and the reason why I call it that is because when we look at all the decision makers who have, quite frankly, were key contributors to the situations that we're in, you can point to individual peoples, but they were representing a council. The CalPERS board and the CalPERS staff it was the institution of CalPERS, the state legislature as an institution. A lot of folks like to say, well, I wasn't here when those things happened. Well, you're still a part of the institution. I can tell you this, it has taken about 18 months for me to work with my own membership to get them to the point to look in the mirror and say, yeah, we should have never negotiated these benefits. I think the first sort of the sign of what is like,
First step's admitting you have a problem?
Admitting you have a problem, right? And I think a lot of times what they want to do is say, well, we acted on, CalPERS said we were never going to run out of money, and the assumptions, they said we had all this money and we were super funded and everything. We should have, the way we derive revenues is different than the state. The way that we can pay these continuing benefits, we're simply never equipped to agree to these benefits. That being said, we seem to be, the cities seem to be the ones at the table trying to say, how can we figure out a way to fix this? And we're trying to get other folks to come to the table and have those conversations. That's a little bit more of a tougher pill to swallow. And when we talk about unfunded liabilities falling on the employer is just a fancy way of saying the taxpayer. I mean, our money is our tax dollars, and so our elected officials are stewards of those tax dollars. And so the challenge that we're having now is, how do we take a pie that is only growing a very small percentage, dealing with one particular line item that's excelling at a massive clip, more so than our revenues. With regards to volatility, CalPERS has done some, have recently made some adjustments to try to reduce volatility. One, trying to go more conservative, lower the discount rate. Two, well, it depends on how you look at it. They reduced their amortization schedule to 20 years, which, depending on how the markets do, could actually be a benefit. But if the markets don't hit their 10-year numbers, which Wilshire says they'll be about 6.1, 6.2%, it's going to lead to more volatility for our local employers. And so again, because of the constitutional restrictions, legislative restrictions, we don't have the ability to make these changes. So yes, we're here saying we should have never agreed to these benefits. They were too generous, but how? But now we need the tools to help us fix those things, and that's what we're asking for.
Really quickly, I wanted to throw one other piece of information in there. There's been a discussion about the court cases on the California rule, and the California rule and what it is. And I think Chuck, gave you a definition that would line up with what you see in a lot of places. keep in mind that the California Supreme Court has 6 members right now. It does not have a 7th member. I wrote this column a couple of weeks ago because I just kind of kept getting interested in it. The governor has not appointed that 7th person, and you have the potential, at least for now, of facing down a court that may get stuck on something that everyone is watching that court to weigh in on. But the point I wanted to get in quickly before we go to the audience is, as I spent more and more time having to become the person reporting on this stuff, which is so complicated because there's so many players at the table, and the taxpayers are ultimately the player that everybody cares about. But as I've explained to groups before, when you look at the unfunded liabilities and the costs of public employee pensions, it is not your clerical worker at the Division of Motor Vehicles that's really where the cost driver is. And it came up, I think, in one of the presentations, is public safety. Public safety retirement obligations are higher than a lot of the others. And I wonder if we could just talk about public safety for a moment. I mean, it is, to me, sometimes the elephant in the room. It's a major cost driver. Do we have to have a discussion about the relative value of those services? I mean, those people, in many cases, put their lives on the line in a way that is very different than other government employees. And they have been given benefits, that are more generous than other employees. And those benefits are costly. I mean, is there a public conversation that has to happen at some point about any of these topics? I know that Mac's not going to jump in on this one immediately, but I mean, it is something that I continue to come back at when I look at these, that we treat government worker as a brand that is generic, and it's not. I mean, these are different benefits for different groups of employees.
Well, I can just real quickly jump in and say that, talking with my members, my elected officials and my city managers and those folks, I've never heard one person say that a firefighter or a cop doesn't deserve the pension that they've agreed to. The challenge that we're trying to face here is, we can't pay for it. We don't know how to pay for it. So I want to diffuse the argument of saying, well, you don't think they deserve it. I'm not saying they don't deserve it. I'm saying that we just simply don't know how. Right now, at this juncture, with it's a math problem. And math isn't, you can't really argue with math. We simply just can't pay for it. And so I know there is a significant disparity in compensation between your general service employee and what you see in public safety. I think another reason why 3 at 50 was agreed upon was there was this notion that that public safety officers don't live as long. Well, 2 things on that. One, the benefit is passed to the spouse, who presumably may not be in public safety, who lives longer. And 2, the mortality rates that, according to CalPERS, sort of leveled out. I mean, it hasn't really shown that public safety officers do, in fact, die faster than your general service employee. All that to be said, it's not that we're saying that cops and firefighters don't deserve pensions. It's a math problem we don't know how to solve.
I think a conversation you're talking about is already happening and will continue to happen because of the rising costs. When I was talking about Sacramento earlier, I didn't mention the police department. The police department staffing has shrunk over the last 10 years in Sacramento, 200 less officers. So that's the first phase of the conversation is we love our police officers, but they're really, really expensive, so we can only afford so many. And that's happened in many jurisdictions. So that's one level of discussion. The second level of discussion is a more difficult one, and it hardly ever happens in a rational basis, which is no matter how much we love our police officers and firefighters, should they make more money in their retirement than they make when they're working? I mean, that's a pure policy question. Answer that for yourselves.
With a big dose of politics.
Right. That's the question. Can we afford them? Well, we have so much money, we know, and you do the math and you end up with less, but what should they be paid? We had that conversation in San Jose on a scale, and that's an interesting conversation. They're really important. They're our number one priority. Should they be paid more than other people? Yes, I think that's kind of generally concluded, at least in San Jose. But should they be paid twice as much or 3 times as much in retirement as you might pay others, or 5 times what you might draw in Social Security? Those are interesting conversations. Not many of them are happening, but they will happen.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience, too? There's a microphone in the back, 2 microphones. Yeah, just raise your hand. They'll come to you.
Question for Mr. Reed and Mr. Hutchings. So it seems that one part of dealing with the issue is not making it worse as we go forward. And one way you make it worse, it seems to me, is that you continue to award high pay raises to employees now, which if they're under the classic benefit, scheme, that increases your unfunded liability. Is it your sense that cities around California and/or the nation have a sense of that and are trying to tamp down the benefits they give right now to employees in their current negotiations, or is it pretty much, status quo in terms of the kinds of raises that employees are continuing to get?
I would say around the country, there are many places where the employees haven't had raises for a lot of years. So if there's a de facto freeze on in terms of general wage increases because jurisdictions don't have the money. So that tends to be kind of effectuating. And so the amount of raise that people get ultimately is decided, about how much money can you spend and how much can you afford. So less people, less money, or more money is a political decision plays out in every budget discussion.
Yeah, and I think just to dovetail off what Chuck mentioned, every city's different, and they handle those negotiations independently. So I can't speak for any particular city who has done benefit increases, but I can tell you just from a 30,000-foot level that one of the challenges that we see is that we do have cities sometimes that have a good surplus year. But they know that when they agree to a salary raise, they're not agreeing to even an ongoing raise for their career. They're agreeing to a lifetime benefit increase. And so one of the challenges is we don't even have the ability to do non-pensionable compensation. I can't give you a regular 3% scheduled raise that's outside of the pension system. It's not allowed by statute. I think a lot of our cities would like that flexibility to say, look, I can't give you a raise right now because I have to. That's going to stack onto the unfunded liability.
Can you give a bonus?
You may be able to give a one-time bonus, but I think that being able to at the negotiating table, a one-time bonus it has a lot less meat to it than saying you have a guaranteed salary increase. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges is how do you try to provide benefit enhancements in a increasingly in a climate that is your payroll shrinking. And knowing that when you agree to that benefit, it's a lifetime agreement, and so that's one of the challenges that we have.
In San Jose, every employee took a 10% pay cut, and it took roughly 5 years to get it back.
And I can tell you that I don't want to speak specifically to the name of the city, but I was at CalPERS just this last week where they were talking about the amortization schedule, and you had employees coming out from Riverside County City that said that all of their employees agreed to a unilateral 25% reduction in pay. I mean, and to me, and again, I can't stress enough that we know that employees are making sacrifices. I think the league gets pushed back because we don't ever recognize the employee. Well, the employees aren't my members. I represent councils and city officials, but I do want to say that I do see cities across the state, their employees are taking those pay cuts, but it's still not enough at this point.
Here's a question over here.
Thanks. It's a comment and a question. If you want to see the ultimate outcome of a bad unfunded pension and a badly run government situation, you just have to look no further than Puerto Rico, which is in bankruptcy court under a control board and has a pension system that has no assets. And so any pensions that will be payable will have to come out of current revenue, and we're not worrying about an unfunded liability anymore because it's totally unfunded. But the question I have is, you mentioned the California rule case that's pending in the state Supreme Court. You have the Janus case pending in the U.S. Supreme Court. The last time the court took up the issue of whether public employees would have to pay union dues whether they're not a member. The court split because Justice Scalia died before the decision. It's a different court now. It's a more conservative-leaning court. What happens if the court says public employee union members don't have to pay union dues? That the checkoff is barred. In Wisconsin, after the legislature passed the rule barring the checkoff, except for public safety employees, union membership just collapsed. So what happens then with the bargaining power of the unions?
Well, I think it affects the bargaining power of the union. If you have less money to work with, you're less effective in political campaigns. But I don't think it affects the issues we're talking about around pensions, just judging from around the country, because in my work around the country, we're working in blue states, purple states, and red states. Problems are very common. And there are states where the public employee unions have almost no power, and they still have pension problems, because this overwhelming urge to overpromise and underfund is universal among Republicans and Democrats.
I've been doing labor politics for 10 years. I mean, it's not as much as some of the other folks on the panel, but I have a feeling that Janus isn't going to be as big of an impact in California as some think. As you mentioned, I know public safety is solid. I mean, these guys, I don't see them taking a huge hit off of voluntary contributions. You may see a little bit of a dip in financing in California, but I don't. You know, I know that it has national implications. You know, and this is just based off my experience, but I don't think it's going to have as huge of an impact in California as we think it will.
I'm also just struck by, and Mac may chime in before we run out of time on this, but related, but a slight bit of a tangent to it, is that when we did the PEPRA overhaul a few years ago at the Capitol, the pension overhaul, statewide pension overhaul, in the wake of that, the different bargaining groups of the state, of employees who came to the table, public safety bargaining units came in early, and you were considered to be proactive in what they were doing. It also was probably smart politics for them because they were the first ones at the table. They got to craft the deal the way they wanted to craft the deal. But it's not as though there's not an engagement on these things, but that is the complicated part then too, right? I mean, about knowing and again, I know this is a tangent, but knowing what set of numbers you're working with once those units come to the table and sit down, whether they have been politically motivated and pushed and riled up by somebody, or whether everybody's using the same kind of numbers they can agree on there. It's just fascinating how public employee sector by group approaches these things differently and uses their collective power. Law enforcement in the state has used it largely by the presence and the importance of their job. Others have used it by politics and campaign donations and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, they're very different groups. You, as we've seen, you've got the public safety who don't have Social Security, so you would expect their costs to be somewhat higher. But it's a very important part, not only for their pension, but also for disability. So, you know, you have just a different group of people there than you do for your miscellaneous. So I think your point's well taken.
Yeah.
Well, and I just to say quickly too is that I think our cities, the feedback I get from my cities too is that those same pressures are at the local level, especially when you talk about regional politics. If you've got one city that has they've granted benefit increases, it puts pressure on neighboring cities to do the same, because cops will, you know, they live in one location. It's just as easy for them to work for this city as opposed to that city, or go work for the county instead. So I think you know, local officials feel the same pressures to try to match what their region is doing.
In the time we have left, we've got just a couple of minutes. I was going to ask maybe, did you have a question? Let's see if we can get in really quickly. We've got time for one more, so I'm going to let the microphone assistants be the ones to do it. And while they're passing the microphone, I'm going to give you my own plug, because that's what I have to do. Last year, at the Los Angeles Times, we worked on a series of stories about pension problems across California. LAtimes.com/pension crisis, where you can find our coverage from the local to the state level. And I was struck when we said that you can't have your own facts. You actually can have your own facts. I was struck by the documents sometimes in these discussions that were not factually correct as time went on about the documents that were used to craft the agreements through some of the communities. But anyway, that being said, yes, sir. I'll give you the last
question for Mac. I looked at local government OPEB obligations in California last year. I found a total over $70 billion, concentrated heavily in two places that might be of interest to you, John: Los Angeles Unified School District and Los Angeles County. Those are the two biggest. They account for about half of it. Anyway, my question is, do you see single-payer healthcare, SB 562, as being the solution to OPEBs? And if so, why or why not?
Man, I That's a tough one. I hadn't thought about that.
And you have 30 seconds.
So we address our whole health there, and what is the effect on OPEB? That's probably the last thing that people think about. Obviously, it would have implications for that. I don't know if those funding programs just go away, get absorbed. Some of them are tied in with collective bargaining. So the short answer is I'm not sure. It's a good question.
But it's certainly an interesting one to watch for because it's the intersection of these topics that, of course, have this long-term impact. So, yeah, good. You've given me one to write down as well. Mac Taylor, Chuck Reed, Dane Hutchings, thank you guys very much. Great conversation. Thank you all.